There is a question that 2 billion Christians and 2 billion Muslims have been arguing about for 1400 years. Not about whether Jesus existed. Both sides agree he did. Not about whether he was born of a virgin. Both sides agree he was. Not about whether he performed miracles, whether he was one of the greatest human beings who ever lived, whether he will return before the end of time. Both sides agree on all of that. They disagree on one thing. Was Jesus a prophet, the greatest prophet before Muhammad, a messenger sent by God to call humanity back to righteousness? Or was Jesus God himself, the eternal Word made flesh, the second person of the Trinity, the one in whom the fullness of the divine nature dwelled bodily? One question, 4 billion people, 1400 years, no resolution. This is not a video designed to resolve it. This is a video designed to help you understand, really understand, from the inside, why both positions are held by serious, thoughtful, deeply faithful people, and why the answer to this question is not a theological technicality. It is the hinge on which everything else turns. There is a moment in the Gospel of John, a single sentence Jesus speaks, that is the sharpest point in this entire debate. A sentence so explosive that the crowd around him reached for stones before he finished speaking. We will get there. But first, what both sides actually believe about the same man. Stay with me. Let us start with what is agreed. Both Christianity and Islam are religions of the book. Both trace their spiritual ancestry to Abraham. Both believe in one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Both believe in angels, in prophets, in revelation, in judgment, in resurrection. And both, this surprises people who have not looked closely, hold Jesus in extraordinarily high regard. The Quran mentions Jesus, Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus son of Mary, more times than it mentions Muhammad, 25 times by name. Jesus is described in the Quran as a word from God, a spirit from God, the Messiah, a prophet of extraordinary power and purity. He healed the sick. He raised the dead. He was born of a virgin. The Quran is as explicit about this as the Gospel of Luke. He will return before the day of judgment to defeat the Antichrist and establish justice on earth. This is not a minor figure in Islam. This is one of the 5 greatest prophets in Islamic theology, alongside Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad. The Islamic tradition loves Jesus. It honors him. It defends him against critics who deny his miracles or question his moral perfection. And then it stops, right at the edge of the Christian claim, and says he is all of that, but he is not God. Here's what most people miss when they look at this disagreement. The distance between the two positions is not about facts. It is about interpretation of the same facts. Both traditions have the virgin birth. Both have the miracles. Both have the teaching, the crucifixion, though Islam disputes what happened on the cross, and the ascension. The raw material is largely shared. What is different is the framework through which that material is read. For Islam, the framework is Tawheed, the absolute, uncompromising, non-negotiable oneness of God. God is one. Not one in three. Not three in one. Not a divine being who enters human history in human form. The idea that God would become a creature, that the infinite would take on the finite, that the eternal would be born and grow and eat and sleep and die, is not just theologically incorrect in Islamic thought. It is the gravest error a human being can make. The Arabic word is shirk, associating partners with God, and the Quran is explicit. This is the one sin that cannot be forgiven. The Christian framework is different, not because Christians have a lower view of God's transcendence, but because Christians believe that God's transcendence did not prevent him from entering creation. The incarnation, the Word becoming flesh, is not a diminishment of God in the Christian view. It is the most radical possible expression of what God is like. A God who loves so completely that he enters the suffering of his creation rather than watching it from a distance. Two frameworks, same man, completely different conclusions. But it gets stranger, because the disagreement does not begin with theology. It begins with history, specifically with what Jesus actually said about himself. Open the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2. Jesus is in a house in Capernaum, surrounded by so many people that 4 men have to cut a hole in the roof to lower their paralyzed friend to him. Jesus looks at the man and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." The teachers of the law sitting in the room go rigid. They think to themselves, and Mark records their thought, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" They were right about the logic. In Jewish theology, only God forgives sins, because sin is ultimately an offense against God. A human being can forgive an offense against themselves. But to pronounce forgiveness for sins in general, sins against God, is to claim divine authority. Jesus does not correct them. He does not say, "No, you misunderstood me. I only mean that God forgives through me." He heals the man instead, as evidence that he has the authority they thought he was claiming. Pay attention to this. This is not a late theological development. This is Mark, the earliest gospel, written within 30 to 40 years of the crucifixion, recording a scene in which Jesus accepts the implication of divine authority over sin. The crowd's reaction tells you what they understood him to be claiming. And then there is John chapter 8. Jesus is in a heated debate with religious leaders in Jerusalem. The argument is about Abraham, about who has the right to claim Abraham as their father, about what it means to be truly free. And then Jesus says something that stops everything. "Very truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am." 2 words in Greek, ego eimi, I am, not I was. Not I existed before Abraham. I am present tense, continuous, eternal. The same construction used in the Greek translation of Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, where God identifies himself to Moses from the burning bush. Aye asher aye. I am who I am. The crowd understands immediately. They do not ask for clarification. They do not say, "What do you mean?" They pick up stones, because in Jewish law, blasphemy, claiming to be God, was punishable by stoning. Jesus does not run because they misunderstood him. He evades them because they understood him perfectly. The Islamic response to this moment is important and serious. The Quran explicitly states that the Jewish and Christian scriptures have been altered over time, Torah, and that the Gospels as we have them do not accurately represent the original revelation given to Jesus. The high Christological claims in the Gospel of John, in particular, reflect the theology of the early church rather than the actual words of the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus, in the Islamic view, was a monotheist who proclaimed the oneness of God. His followers over time elevated him to divine status. This is not a fringe argument. It is taken seriously by many academic scholars of early Christianity as well. The Gospel of John was written later than the Synoptic Gospels. Its theology is more developed. Its Jesus speaks in long, sophisticated discourses that sound different from the shorter, more parabolic teaching style of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Christian counterargument is equally serious, and it rests on a piece of evidence that most people on both sides of this debate do not know well enough. Now watch what happens when you go back before the Gospels. The Gospel of John was written approximately 60 to 90 years after the crucifixion. If you want to argue that high Christology developed over decades, John is your best evidence. But Paul's letter to the Philippians was written approximately 25 years after the crucifixion, within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, within living memory of the events themselves. And in that letter, Paul quotes what most scholars believe is an even earlier Christian hymn, something the community was already singing before Paul wrote it down. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. This is not late legend. This is theology that predates Paul's letter, which itself predates the Gospels. The worship of Jesus as divine was not a development that emerged gradually over centuries, and was finally codified at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. It was present from the beginning, within decades of the crucifixion, within the lifetime of people who had known Jesus personally, Communities across the Mediterranean were singing hymns that placed Jesus on the same level as God. Ignatius of Antioch, writing in 107 AD, within a decade of the Apostle John's death, calls Jesus our God multiple times in his letters. This is not Nicaea. This is the early 2nd century, within living memory of the apostles. Here's the part nobody tells you. The Council of Nicaea in 325 did not invent the doctrine of Jesus' divinity. It clarified a debate about the precise nature of that divinity, specifically, whether Jesus was of the same substance as the Father or merely similar in substance. The council was not deciding whether Jesus was divine. It was deciding exactly how divine. The raw claim that Jesus is God was already there, already widespread, already being sung in churches across the world, before any emperor convened any council. The Muslim who says the Council of Nicaea invented the Trinity is making a historical claim that the evidence does not support. The Christian who says the doctrine of the Trinity was always obvious and uncontested is also making a historical claim that the evidence does not fully support. The honest picture is more interesting than either caricature. And now, that moment I mentioned at the very beginning. C.S. Lewis was a professor of medieval literature at Oxford, a former atheist, and one of the most precise thinkers of the 20th century. In Mere Christianity, he formulated what has become the most famous argument about the identity of Jesus in the modern era. He said, "The one option that is not available to you is the option most people in the modern West want to take, that Jesus was a great moral teacher but not God. The reason that option is unavailable," Lewis argued, "is the claims Jesus actually made. A man who says what Jesus said, that he can forgive sins, that he existed before Abraham, that he and the Father are one, that all authority in heaven and on earth belongs to him, that he is the way, the truth, and the life, is not giving you the option of respectful admiration for his ethical teaching. He is forcing a choice. Either the claims are false, in which case, and Lewis was deliberate about this, Jesus is not a great moral teacher who got a bit carried away. He is either a deliberate deceiver who knew the claims were false and made them anyway, or he is genuinely deluded about his own identity, what Lewis called a lunatic, comparing him to a man who believes he is a poached egg. Or the claims are true, liar, lunatic, or Lord. The Muslim response to the trilemma is to go upstream of it. The trilemma assumes the gospel accounts accurately record what Jesus claimed. If they do not, if the high Christological claims are the product of early church theology rather than the words of the historical Jesus, then the trilemma does not apply. Jesus was a prophet who proclaimed the oneness of God. His followers, after his death, made claims about him that he never made about himself. N.T. Wright, one of the most respected New Testament historians alive, responds to this by examining the resurrection, not as a theological claim but as a historical question. Why did the earliest followers of Jesus, Jewish monotheists for whom the idea of a human being God was as offensive as it is in Islam, begin worshiping Jesus within years of his death? What event is sufficient to explain that? The body staying in the tomb explains why the movement died. The disciples hiding in an upper room explains why no one heard of it again. The movement exploded across the Mediterranean within a generation. Something happened. The question is what? The Muslim answer: Jesus was raised to heaven by God before the crucifixion, or was not crucified at all. The Quran is somewhat ambiguous, and his followers misunderstood or misrepresented what happened. The Christian answer: he rose bodily from the dead, was seen by hundreds of witnesses, and the resurrection is the event that explains everything else. Both answers require faith. Both answers require trusting a historical record that cannot be fully verified by modern methods. Both are held by serious people who have examined the evidence carefully and reached different conclusions. And this is where the conversation arrives at the place where it has always been, not a question of evidence alone, but a question of what you believe about the nature of God. Does Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, preclude the incarnation? Can the infinite become finite without ceasing to be infinite? Can the eternal enter time without being limited by it? The Muslim said, the very suggestion dishonors God. The Christian said, the incarnation is not a limitation of God but the fullest possible expression of what God is, a love so total that it enters the suffering of creation rather than remaining outside it. Two understandings of God, both ancient, both serious, both held by billions of human beings across 1,400 years of history, not a disagreement about minor doctrinal points, a disagreement about the deepest possible question: what is God like? Before I give you the 3 things I want you to carry out of this video, if this has opened something for you, subscribe and share it with someone who has spent years on one side of this argument without really understanding what the other side is saying, because the conversation is more serious and more interesting than the shouting match it usually becomes. 3 things. First, both Christianity and Islam hold Jesus in extraordinarily high regard. The disagreement is not between those who love Jesus and those who dismiss him. Both traditions honor him. Both believe in his miraculous birth, his signs and wonders, his moral perfection, his return. The single point of divergence, is he God or a prophet, is a small distance in words and an infinite distance in implication. Every other theological difference between the two traditions flows from that one question. Second, the historical evidence is more complex than either side usually admits. The doctrine of Jesus' divinity was not invented at the Council of Nicaea. It is present in Paul's letters written within 25 years of the crucifixion, within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. At the same time, the Islamic argument that the Gospels do not perfectly preserve the original teachings of the historical Jesus is taken seriously by many academic scholars. Neither the simple Christian narrative nor the simple Islamic narrative fully accounts for the complexity of the historical record. The honest conversation requires both sides to hold their position with more humility than they usually do. Third, and this is the one I want you to sit with, C.S. Lewis was right about one thing, regardless of which side you are on. Jesus does not give you the comfortable middle option. The claims recorded in the Gospels, whether you believe they accurately represent what Jesus said or not, do not describe a man who was simply a wise teacher and nothing more. If the claims are authentic, Lewis's trilemma applies with full force. If they are not authentic, if they represent the early church's theology rather than Jesus' own words, then the question becomes, what did actually happen in first-century Palestine that turned a group of Jewish monotheists into people who worshipped a human being as God within decades of his death? Both questions demand an answer. Both answers require more than casual assumption. Has this video changed the way you think about either tradition or about the question itself? Tell me below. I read every single one. Jesus was born of a virgin, performed miracles, taught with an authority unlike any teacher before or since, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and left behind a question that 4 billion people are still arguing about today. He is either the most important human being who ever lived, or something more than human. The evidence does not let you look away, and neither does he.